Дорогий Тоні,
Dear
ласкаво
Tony,
просимо
welcome
до Києва.
to Kiev.
Я думаю, тут
I
не
think
потрібні
there is,
формальні
we don't need any formal
що
invitation,
цей час
greetings,
спільної
because
роботи,
during this time we
особливо
joint work,
з моменту початку
specifically
повномасштабного
with the
вторгнення,
beginning of the large-scale invasion,
відносини між
our
Україною і Сполученими
relationship between
Штатами вийшли
Ukraine
на
and
той
the
рівень,
United States, they
коли не
went
потрібні
to such level
формальності,
that we don't need,
потрібна щира,
we
дружня
need
і
everything what we
максимально
need is just
відверта
open and sincere
розмова. Саме така,
conversation, and this
яку
is
ми мали
what we
сьогодні.
had today.
Але насамперед
However,
хочу подякувати
I would like to
державному
thank
секретареві
the
за те,
State
що
Secretary
ми
for
розпочали день з
you beginning
відвідання
today
Берковецького цвинтаря.
visiting the cemetery, Berkovetsky
Трошки
cemetery.
ширше можу прокоментувати.
Yes, I
По
will
суті,
comment.
сьогодні ми
Just
започаткували
today we
нову
began a
традицію.
new
І я
tradition,
дякую, що
and I
державний секретар
I'm
підтримав
grateful
це і
to
став
the State Secretary
першим
for being the
главою
first
зовнішньополітичного
chief
відомства іноземного,
of the
який
foreign
розпочав свій
service
візит
of international of other countries
вшанування
who began his visit with
могил
honoring
українських солдатів,
fallen
які
Ukrainian
загинули,
soldiers who died
відбуваючи
repelling
повномасштабне
the
вторгнення.
large-scale invasion.
Сьогодні я сказав
Today,
Тоні, що
I
таких
mentioned,
цвинтарів по всій
we
Україні,
have
на
so
жаль,
many,
сотні.
unfortunately, we have hundreds of such
Їх всі
cemeteries across Ukraine,
впізнають, тому що
everyone,
над цими могилами майорять
and
прапори
they are visible
України,
because
прапори
on the
бригад,
graves of
в яких
soldiers we
воювали
have
солдати.
flags.
І я хочу щиро
I'd like
подякувати
to
Тоні за те,
sincerely
що
thank
він
Tony for
сьогодні був
today.
зі мною там, і
He was
розділив цей
there with
емоційний
me, and
момент,
he shared this
і
emotional
віддав
moment
шану
with me. He
загиблим,
honored the fallen.
але також
However,
продемонстрував
also,
найвищий рівень поваги
he demonstrated the
до тих
highest
солдатів
level of
українських,
respect to
які
Ukrainian
продовжують,
soldiers who are
які
continuing to
ведуть
fight,
контрнаступ,
who are
які
continuing the
беруть участь в
counteroffensive,
оборонних боях
and they're
і
participating
захищають
in
Україну.
defensive action, and they defend Ukraine.
Для мене сьогодні
For
було
me
дуже
today it
важливо
was very
почути
important
слова
to hear the
державного
words of the
секретаря
State
про
Secretary about
високу
the
оцінку
high
дій
estimate
наших
of the actions
солдатів,
of our
наших
soldiers,
офіцерів, наших
of
сил
officers,
оборони України.
and of all defense
Це
forces of
дійсно
Ukraine.
та
It's
об'єктивна
truly
оцінка,
objective
яка враховує
assessment
складну
that
реальність на
includes
фронті,
the difficult
які
reality in the
подвиги,
battlefield and
які
those
вчиняють
heroic actions
українські
that
військові.
Ukrainian soldiers are doing.
Але насамперед тепер давайте пройдемо по
let's
субстантивній
Get
частині
to the
наших
substantive
переговорів.
part of our negotiations.
Сьогодні
Today
ми вкотре переконалися, що
we,
Сполучені Штати залишаються
learned one
провідним
more time
союзником
that
України
the United
у
States continue
протидії
to be the
російській
leading
агресії. Ми надзвичайно
partner
цінуємо
and ally
політичну,
in the
фінансову,
rebelling Russian.
гуманітарну,
It
енергетичну
relates to all of the
допомогу,
issues,
яка надходить від
humanitarian,
Сполучених Штатів.
energy, military, everything
І
that comes from the United
ми
States,
дякуємо
and we're grateful for that.
адміністрації
We're
президента
grateful to the
Байдена,
Biden administration
зовнішньополітичній команді президента,
for the
особисто
presidential
державному
foreign
секретареві,
service and specifically to the State
Конгресу,
Secretary, to Congress,
і кожному
and
американцю, який
every
підтримує Україну в цій
American citizen who
боротьбі.
supports Ukraine in this fight.
Військова допомога, яка
Military
надається
aid that
Україні,
is provided
також
to
фінансова
Ukraine
допомога
and
та інші
financial
види допомоги,
and other
вона не
types
є
of
благодійністю.
These are
Я
not
хочу ще раз
charity.
це
I would
підкреслити.
like to underline this
Це
one more time.
найвигідніша
This is the most,
безпекова інвестиція
this is
США
the most profitable
безпеку
investment
в
into the
Європі,
security of
євроатлантичному просторі
Europe and
і
Euro-Atlantic
в усьому
space
світі.
and the whole world.
Сьогодні
Today,
Україна за підтримки
Ukraine
партнерів
with the support of
стримує
partners
Росію, змушує її
we hold
відмовитися
the
від своїх
advance of Russia
агресивних планів
to
на
make them to
підпорядкування своєї волі
decline their
держав світу.
and
При
imposing
цьому
their will on other
безпрецедентно в
countries.
історії
And
жодне американське життя
besides,
ми не ставимо під загрозу.
we're not
Ми ведемо
putting any
цю боротьбу
American
своїми
soldier's
силами.
life under the threat.
Наші люди воюють,
It's our people who are
використовуючи,
fighting, using and
зокрема,
employing
зброю наших
specifically
партнерів.
weapon
Ми
systems of
ніколи
our
не
partners.
закликали
We never asked
ввести американські
to
війська на
send the
територію
US
України.
troops to
Ніколи не будемо
Ukraine,
цього
and we are
робити.
not going to ask this.
Але дійсно ми
But
потребуємо
we
підтримки
truly
у цій боротьбі.
need support in
І ця
this fight.
підтримка є
And
також
this
визнанням
support
тієї
is
місії,
also
яку
recognition of this mission
виконує Україна
that
в
Ukraine
глобальному
carries out in
контексті
a
історії.
global history context.
Ми сьогодні,
Today,
безумовно, не буде для вас сюрпризом, ми сьогодні
it's
багато
not a
говорили
surprise.
про
We spoke a
зброю
lot about
і
weapons.
Ми дякуємо
We thank
за вже
for
ухвалені рішення,
already
дякуємо за рішення,
approved
які будуть
decisions
анонсовані.
and
Це дуже
funded
важливо.
decisions. It's very
Державний
important.
секретар повернеться
State
до
Secretary
Вашингтону з
is going to
максимально
go back
точним
with maximum
розумінням
clear
наших потреб.
our
Ми обговорили
necessities and our
збільшення
requirements to increase
протиповітряної
Air
зміцнення
defense
протиповітряної
capabilities.
оборони. Ви сьогодні буквально по дорозі,
We
коли державний
today on the
секретар
way,
був в дорозі до
and when the
Києва,
State Secretary was
Київ
on the way,
пережив
Kiev
черговий ракетний
experienced
обстріл,
another
але
rocket
і
barrage,
інші регіони України
and
постраждали.
other
Тому, власне,
areas of
ми
Ukraine
не
they
дуже
suffered
багато часу
losses.
витратили на обговорення
We
потреб у
didn't
сфері
spend a
протиповітряної
lot of
оборони,
time
тому що нема що
on discussing
обговорювати.
air defense because there's nothing to
Все
discuss.
очевидно,
Everything is
потреба
obvious.
надзвичайно висока,
The requirement is very
важлива,
in high demand.
і я
And
лише
very
озвучив ту
important. I
кількість
just
систем
mentioned the
протиповітряної
number
оборони,
of systems that
яка
air
потрібна,
defense
щоб
systems that
захистити
are
і зерновий
necessary
коридор,
to protect the grain
і
corridor
наші міста,
and our
і
cities
наших
and
людей.
our people.
Я хочу
I would
подякувати
like to
окремо
thank specifically and
Сполученим
separately
Штатам
the
за
United
рішення
States for decision
дозволити
to allow
іншим країнам
other countries
розпочати тренування пілотів
F-16
на літаках
training
F-16 і, власне,
for
передачу
pilots.
самих літаків.
And
Ми
also
останнім
the
часом
transfer of
багато
those
дякували
planes.
Данії, Нідерландам,
We thanked
Норвегії,
Denmark,
які вже заявили
Norway,
про готовність передати
Netherlands,
Україні певну кількість
who
літаків.
announced that they are
Дякували
ready
тим
to
країнам,
transfer
які
F-16s.
оголосили про навчання пілотів.
We are thankful to
Але в
those
кожній цій
countries
подяці
who are going to train
велика
our pilots,
подяка
but in all
була
of those
адресована
things,
саме Сполученим
a lot
Штатам,
of that
без рішення
belongs to the
яких
United States because without their
ці країни не
decision,
могли
these
б
countries
ухвалити свої рішення,
wouldn't be able
тому що
to approve those decisions
F-16
on
є
their side
американським літаком.
because F-16 is an American airplane.
Детально проговорили
In
сьогодні
details,
питання
we
надання
discussed
Україні далекобійних ракет
providing
«Атакамс».
long-range
Мали
rockets,
дуже
ATACMS.
предметну розмову,
We had
і я радий, що
substantive discussion.
ця опція
Very happy
залишається
that
відкритою.
this option
Ми
is still open,
розраховуємо,
and we're
що
expecting and we're relying
дискусії
on
всередині
discussion
адміністрації
inside of
будуть
the
призведуть
presidential
до
administration,
позитивного рішення. Сьогодні
American
ми
presidential administration.
зупинилися на
We're
цьому окремо.
waiting so they would stop and discuss this more.
Ви знаєте, що мало залучати
We know
зброю
that
партнерів.
it's
Ми
not just
розуміємо,
enough
що
to
зараз і Україна, і весь світ
just bring
потребують
other countries' weapons here.
нарощування
We need
виробництва
to
зброї
increase production
різного
of
типу.
weapons of different types.
І дійсно в історії є часи, коли
Truly
світ
that
роззброюється,
there were
але
times
зараз
for the
настали
world
часи, коли світ вимушений.
to get rid of weapons, but now the world is
Тому
arming itself.
я поінформував
I
державного
informed the
секретаря
State
про
Secretary
наш план
on
провести в
our
Києві
plan
перший
to
форум
hold
оборонних індустрій,
first
на
forum
якому
of
українські
defense
та іноземні
industries,
компанії
where
об'єднають
Ukrainian
зусилля
international companies
зі спільного
are going to
виробництва
join their efforts
і обслуговування
to
зброї. Я також наголосив, що по суті йдеться
develop
про
and maintenance
інтеграцію української оборонної
weapons.
індустрії
We're going to
в
integrate
оборонну
the defense
індустрію
industry
НАТО.
of Ukraine to NATO.
Я дякую державному
industry.
секретареві
And
за
I'm
підтвердження,
grateful for the
що
State Secretary
США та
for
американські
confirming that
компанії візьмуть
the US
участь
and
у
American
цьому
companies
важливому
will
заході.
participate in this very important event.
Декілька слів,
A couple
я вже
words
згадував зерновий експорт,
on,
тут наші
about
позиції
grain
абсолютно
export.
збігаються.
Our
Ми
views are
вважаємо, що
common.
найбільш
We think that the
перспективним
most perspective
є
is
Дунайський
the
коридор, будемо
Danube
працювати
Danube
над його
grain corridor.
розвитком.
We're going to develop it and we're going to
Окремо було велике
and
питання у нас
separately we
сьогодні,
discussed,
звісно, про формулу
of course,
миру.
peace formula,
Ми скоординували
and we
подальші
coordinated
кроки
future
щодо
next steps
зміцнення, розширення кола
increase and
учасників
strengthen
цієї
the
ініціативи
circle of
президента
participants.
Зеленського.
And as an initiative of the
Ми
President
констатували,
Zelensky,
що формула миру є базовим
we stated that
таким планом
peace
припинення
formula
війни
is the
в
foundation
Україні,
for
і в цьому тут є
stopping
історичний
war,
момент
and
теж,
there's
тому
this
що
historical moment in
в
this.
суті, ну принаймні вперше на моїй пам'яті,
It's first time
правила
to my
припинення
memory
війни
that the
визначаються не
rules
третьою
of the end
стороною,
of the war
не
not
агресором,
decided
а
not,
самою Україною,
not by the
на яку
aggressor,
напали, і яка
but the
відбувається
rules
від
of
агресії.
stopping
Це
the
дуже
war
важливий
is setting by
випадок для міжнародних
the
відносин,
country
для
that was
міжнародної дипломатії.
attacked.
І
It's
це
very
дуже
important for the
справедливий
international
випадок, це дуже
diplomacy,
справедливий підхід.
international law. It's a
Тому
fair
тут
and
ми
just approach,
домовилися
and
про
that's why
конкретні
we
кроки, яких
agreed upon
які
next
будемо спільно вживати.
steps, and we're going to take together.
І зрештою, я ще хочу одне питання
Finally,
згадати, це цивільні
one
полонені.
question
Я
I'd like to
поінформував
mention is the
державного
prisoners,
секретаря про
I
те,
informed
що
the State Secretary
Росія зараз
that
втілює
Russia
наймасштабнішу в
implements
новітній історії
the most massive
операцію із захоплення
operation
цивільних
in the
осіб у
new
полон.
history on
Десятки
imprisonment
тисяч
of
людей,
civilians.
цивільних,
Tens
не
of
військових,
thousands of people
опиняються в російському
are
полоні
getting
тільки
into
через те, що вони
Russian
українці якимось з
captivity
якоїсь причини
simply because
не
they
подобаються
are Ukrainians
російським
and they are not
окупаційним властям.
in the Russian occupation.
Ми в Україні зрозуміли,
power don't
що
like it. They don't
світові
like them.
потрібні
We understand
більш
that the
дієві
world
механізми для того,
needs
щоб
more
рятувати цих людей.
proactive mechanism to
Тут ще є
remove
багато
those
запитань,
people. There are still many
але
questions,
ми не повинні
but we shouldn't
дозволити Росії
allow
створити
Russia to
прецедент,
establish a
яким
precedent
користуватимуться і вона, і інші
where them and
злонавмисні
other
режими,
evil
щоб
regimes
використовувати цивільних людей як
can
заручників.
use imprisonment
Ну,
of
ми домовилися,
civilians
що
as a
наші
weapon of
експертні
war.
команди проведуть
Our
консультації
both expert teams will
щодо того,
hold consulting
які інструменти
in
наявні в
discussing what
міжнародному праві
international law
можуть бути
instruments
задіяні
and
для
tools
звільнення
are
цих людей,
available
а у разі
to
потреби, які
release these
інструменти
people,
мають бути
and
створені
maybe
для
to
того, щоб
discuss
цих людей
what
рятувати.
tools
І
should
наостанок я
be
хочу
installed.
подякувати
And would like to thank
державному
also
секретареві дійсно
the
за
State
те, що
Secretary
що б ми не обговорювали, великі
everything
дипломатичні
that we
зусилля,
discussed, all of the
як формула
efforts,
миру,
like peace formula,
відносини з африканськими
relations with
країнами,
African countries,
зброю,
weapons,
контрнаступ.
counteroffensive.
В центрі цих дискусій для
All of
державного
that in the center
секретаря
of discussion
завжди
for the State
знаходиться
Secretary was
людина.
always a person
Її
is in the
безпека,
center,
її
a
права
person's security,
і
a person's
свобода.
rights and freedom.
І саме завдяки такому підходу ми
because of
завжди
this
знаходимо
approach,
рішення.
we always
Тому що
find
все, що ми
solutions.
робимо, ми
Because everything
робимо
what we do, we
для
do
людей.
for the people.
І це стосується
And this
навіть таких
relates
речей,
to
як
such
повернення
things as returning
Макдональдса в Україну,
returning McDonald's to
який
Ukraine,
повернувся і став
which
символом
returned
повернення
and
великого
became a
американського
symbol
бізнесу,
of returning of American
символом
business
впевненості в
back,
тому, що
and
в
the symbol
Україні
of
можна вести
assurance
великий бізнес
that it's
і
possible to
бути
create a
поруч з
big
людьми
business in
у
Ukraine and
важливий
be with
для
the
них
people
важкий для
during
них момент.
hard and
Тому, дорогі
important times
пані,
in their
ще раз
life.
дякую
And
тобі за цей
and
візит,
thank you very much
за
one more
своєчасний.
time.
Переговори,
And for the
які
negotiations that
ми провели,
we
які
held
мав з прем'єр-міністром
with the
України
Prime Minister,
і з
with the
президентом
President
України,
of Ukraine.
вони були дуже
They were
змістовні.
very,
Я
fruitful
переконаний, що
and,
найближчим часом
sure
будуть
that
ухвалюватися
in the
конкретні
future we
рішення
will
за
have
результатами
some
цих переговорів.
new
Ми й надалі
decisions
рухатимемося вперед.
and we'll continue our
будь-хто
motion ahead.
В світі,
No one in the
хто
world
сумнівається
who is
у
doubting
тому, що
that
Україна і Сполучені
Ukraine and the
Штати
United States
стоятимуть
will
пліч-о-пліч у цій
stand
війні до
shoulder by
перемоги.
shoulder till the end of
Сьогодні
the
отримали
victory.
черговий
Today they
сигнал,
saw and
що
they
вони
received
глибоко
a new signal
помиляються.
that they are wrong.
Ми йдемо вперед,
We're moving forward
разом,
together
тому що ми
because
розуміємо,
we
що ця війна
understand
не
this
лише
war
про
not
майбутнє
just
України.
about it's not
Вона
about
про
the
майбутнє
future of
всього
Ukraine.
світу.
It's
Ми
about the
маємо
future of the
захистити
world,
цей
and we
світ
should
спільно.
defend
Дякую.
this world
Тоні, будь
jointly.
ласка.
Tony, please.
Dmytro, thank you very, very much. Let me start by saying how moving it was to join you this morning in paying tribute to Ukraine's fallen soldiers who gave their lives for the freedom of this country. We talk about numbers and statistics a lot, but standing there with Dmytro in front of the graves of the fallen and seeing the photographs of each one brings home powerfully the real story, the human story of lives lost, cut short because of this horrific Russian aggression. And it's also a powerful reminder of the extraordinary resilience, courage, and determination of the Ukrainian people and Ukraine's armed forces. This is now my 6th trip as Secretary of State to Ukraine and the 4th since the Russian full-scale invasion began February 24th of 2022. And I keep seeing the same thing, that determination, that resilience, that commitment on the part of all Ukrainians to build a future where they can live safely and live freely in a thriving democracy, fully integrated with Europe. Ukraine is the home of incredibly proud people who are driven by a fierce belief in themselves. themselves, in their freedom, in their right to choose their own path. A nation united by common sacrifice, but fortified by the righteousness of their fight. And that spirit is everywhere. I saw it again today in the men and women who are reopening or visiting businesses in Kyiv, in the children returning to class for the new school year, in the families and communities defiantly continuing to live their lives, even as Putin seeks to end them. The United States is committed to empowering Ukraine to write its own future. In the crucible of President Putin's brutal and ongoing war, the United States and Ukraine have forged a partnership that is stronger than ever and growing every day. We will continue to stand by Ukraine's side, and today we're announcing new assistance totaling more than $1 billion in this common effort. That includes $665.5 million in new military and civilian security assistance. In total, we committed over $43 billion in security assistance since the beginning of the Russian aggression. Now, since I was last here almost exactly 1 year ago, Ukrainian forces have taken back more than 50% of the territory seized by Russian forces since February of 2022. In the ongoing counteroffensive, progress has accelerated in the past few weeks. This new assistance will help sustain it and build further momentum. The assistance includes an additional $175 million in drawdown authority that will provide significant support for Ukraine's air defenses, a critical need, as you've heard Dmytro say, among other areas. Another $100 million in foreign military financing to support Ukraine's longer-term military needs. $300 million to support law enforcement efforts to restore and maintain law and order in liberated areas. We're sending our first delivery of mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles to Ukraine's border guards and police, some of whom I'll have an opportunity to visit with tomorrow. And we're providing critical assistance for demining to help clear Russian landmines, unexploded ordnance, and other daily remnants of war killing and maiming civilians. Ukraine is now the world's most heavily mined country. 30% of its territory is potentially covered with mines. Russia's weapons of war have killed hundreds of civilians and threatened to put millions at risk for years, even decades to come. The new security funding that we're announcing today will also be bolstered by the arrival of U.S. Abrams tanks this fall and by training for Ukrainian pilots on F-16s in the United States, complementing training that is already underway in Europe. Even as we maximize our support for Ukraine to counter the current Russian aggression, we're committed to helping Ukraine build a force for the future that can deter and defend against future aggression. Today, with President Zelensky, I discussed longer-term sustainable security arrangements, which will provide ongoing security assistance and modern military equipment across land, air, sea, and cyberspace, as well as training and intelligence sharing. The State Department is leading these discussions, which will continue in the months ahead. 28 other countries are making similar commitments through the G7 Declaration of Support for Ukraine, in no small part because they recognize, as the Foreign Minister said, that Ukraine's security is integral to the security of the entire Euro-Atlantic community, and indeed, it's integral to security around the world because of the principles that are being challenged here, as well as Ukrainian lives and livelihoods. Together, these 29 countries that are committed to supporting Ukraine over the long term will coordinate and share the burden of that long-term support. In the more immediate term, we are working with Congress across parties to provide additional short-term funds in the supplemental funding bill this month. At the same time, we will continue to support Ukraine as it works to build international consensus for a just and durable peace that upholds the UN Charter and its fundamental principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, independence. Beyond Ukraine's security needs, for the first time, we are transferring to Ukraine assets seized from sanctioned Russian oligarchs, which will now be used to support Ukrainian military veterans. Those who have enabled Putin's war of aggression should pay for it. We're continuing life-saving humanitarian assistance, emergency shelter for those whose homes Russia has destroyed, medical support and health care for survivors of relentless Russian missile attacks and shelling, including, as we saw again last night and today. Food, clean drinking water, generators for communities. Today we're committing an additional $206 million toward that effort, much of which is dedicated to helping the more than 6 million Ukrainians who are displaced by Russia's war. As Russia continues to weaponize food, we're helping people within Ukraine and around the world who are suffering from extreme hunger as well as malnutrition. Not content with pulling out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which has sent 32 million metric tons of Ukrainian grain to the world, the equivalent of more than 18 billion loaves of bread, most of it to developing countries, Putin is now bombing Ukrainian granaries and warehouses, mining port entrances, driving up food prices around the world, devastating Ukrainian farmers. Now, Russia claims it would be willing to return to the Black Sea Grain Initiative if its conditions are met. The United Nations has put forward a proposal that meets those conditions, but Putin continues to hold out. Meanwhile, Russia is using the hunger and market distortion that it's created to profit from record-breaking exports of its own grain. As we build international pressure on Russia to return to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, we're working with Ukraine to find and use alternative routes for its grain shipments to other countries. For Ukraine not only to survive, but to thrive, we're also supporting its efforts to rebuild from Russia's aggression. At the Ukraine Recovery Conference held in London a few months ago, I pledged that the United States would invest more than $520 million in making Ukraine's energy infrastructure, more than half of which has been destroyed by Russia, cleaner, more resilient, and more integrated with Europe. We're making new investments to enhance the transparency of Ukraine's institutions and to bolster the rule of law so that Ukraine's democracy is even more responsive to the needs of its people and can attract the private capital needed to rebuild. We're engaged in assisting the government of Ukraine on anti-corruption efforts and on efforts to ensure accountability and full transparency of all the assistance we're providing, as well as the security of U.S.-provided defense articles and technologies. President Zelensky and I discussed these issues today and the importance to Ukraine's democratic future of continued reforms and the fight against corruption. A few months ago in Helsinki, I spoke to how President Putin's war in Ukraine has been and will continue to be a strategic failure for Russia. There's no better demonstration of that than seeing the Ukrainian people, whose national identity Putin sought to erase, stronger and more unified than ever before. As I said then, no one has done more to intensify Ukrainians' determination to write their own future on their own terms than President Putin. Now, we have no illusions that the path forward will be easy, but this is a fight that we must and we will win. For any country threatened by bullies or would-be aggressors, for all who seek a future of security and peace. And my message today on behalf of President Biden and the United States to the Ukrainian people is, just as we have stood with you to ensure your nation's survival over these past 20 months, so we will stand with you as you determine your future and rebuild a free, a resilient, a thriving Ukraine.
Questions. The first one goes to Wall Street Journal. William.
Thank you so much, both of you. Secretary Blinken, you said you have no illusions that the fight will be easy. What did you hear, what one or two things did you hear on this trip from President Zelensky or others that you can take back to President Biden and the American people and say this is a fight that Ukraine can win, or this is a fight that it makes sense for the U.S. to support? And also, for Foreign Minister Kuleba, I wanted to ask a similar question. Are you at all worried about waning political support for the war in Ukraine in the United States? Thank you.
Will, thank you. First, as I said, it's important to put where we are, where Ukraine is in perspective. As I mentioned a moment ago, I was last here almost exactly a year ago, and in that time, in the year since I was last here, Ukraine has taken back more than 50% of the territory that Russia has seized from it since February of 2022. In the current counteroffensive, we are seeing real progress over the last few weeks. As it happens, President Zelensky just returned from the front line, so I was able to hear directly from him his assessment of the counteroffensive, and I think it very much matches our own, which is, as I said, real progress in recent weeks. We are doing everything we can to maximize our support to Ukraine as it pursues the counteroffensive. And ultimately, as I've said before, one thing above all other things will make the difference, I'm convinced. Beyond the extraordinary work that Ukrainians are doing, beyond even the equipment, the support, the training that we and dozens of other nations are providing, the fundamental difference maker is that Ukrainians are fighting for their own country, for their own future, for their own freedom. Russians are not. And that gives me tremendous confidence that Ukraine will prevail.
As I mentioned, I believe that Secretary and this administration and both parties in the Congress understand that what is being decided here in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine, it's about the way the world will look like. Because if Russia manages to succeed even partially, it will be a clear motivational signal, a clear encouragement to all other malign forces across the globe to solve problems through the use of force. The second argument is also, I think, very simple. I don't want to sound rude, but the question is, if the West cannot win in this war, then what is the war that the West can win? And when I say the West, I include Ukraine to this list as well. But I think the most important part of your answer comes from the Secretary himself, from his concluding lines, that Ukraine, as you said, should win and must win and will win. And this is exactly the philosophy that is being then implemented into specific decisions that gives me reasons to believe that we are continuing our walk towards victory, and it's deeply appreciated.
Вітаю, маю таке запитання до
Hello.
пані Ентоні.
I have such
Буквально
question
декілька
to,
тижнів тому вам
Mr.
вдалося поговорити
Anthony.
з американцем Полом
What
Віланом,
I
якого Росія
discussed
вже
with Paul Whelan,
близько 4 років утримує у в'язниці.
Russia is
Зокрема,
holding him for 4 years in
Росія
the
також
prison.
утримує і
And
наших
also
українців.
Russia is
І має до
holding
вас
our
питання, чи
Ukrainians in
долучиться
prison.
США, можливо, до переговорного процесу,
will
або якось
United
інакше
States
зможе
will
допомогти Україні
get
повернути наших
engaged
громадян? Дякую.
into the discussion and to the negotiations of returning Ukrainians from the prison?
Thank you very much. First, let me say that for me, the well-being, the security, the safety of Americans everywhere, and particularly overseas, is my number one responsibility, and that very much goes to Americans who are being unjustly detained, including Paul Whelan, and of course, Evan Gershkovich. We are focused every day on trying to bring them and other unjustly detained Americans home. When it comes to Ukrainians who are being detained, civilians, as you've heard Dmytro refer to, as well as prisoners of war, of course, Ukraine has been in the lead on seeking to secure their freedom. But if there are any ways we can support that effort and help that effort, of course, we'll do it.
Next one goes to CNN, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for doing this, both of you. Mr. Secretary, yesterday Russia and Saudi Arabia announced they would continue their voluntary oil production cuts, and that's already seen a surge in oil prices. Are you concerned that this is going to have an impact on Americans at the pump, and are there going to be consequences for Riyadh, as was warned last year when we saw similar moves? And then to both of you, today Putin spoke with MBS and praised their economic cooperation. Does this give you concerns that Saudi Arabia could be an honest broker in any peace negotiations, given the close ties between the two? Thank you.
So our focus is on making sure of two things, that energy remains readily available and that there's sufficient supply on the market to meet demand, and of course that this is done at a reasonable price. We are always looking to see what those who are producers and suppliers of energy are doing in terms of that supply and the effects that it's going to have on the market. So we will look at this carefully in the days and weeks ahead to see the results that it actually produces. You can get an immediate bump in price, but that may quickly settle down to something lower. So it's something we'll be looking at, again, with the objective of ensuring that there is sufficient energy on world markets to meet demand and at a fair price.
Ukrainian soldier is the most honest broker in this war, because we all understand that the road to any diplomatic process lays through the battlefield. In diplomacy, I think one of the finest arts of diplomacy is the art of separation. It's like in cooking. And I believe it's no coincidence that while Saudi Arabia and Russia discuss strengthening economic cooperation, Saudi Arabia hosts a very important meeting in Jeddah dedicated to the realization of peace formula proposed by Ukraine. And I believe that the art of Saudi diplomacy here is to separate these tracks. And we welcome their effort to bring together various countries, to make them sit at the table in Saudi Arabia and discuss how to restore peace in Ukraine on Ukraine's terms. This is very important.
Валерія, прошу вас.
Thank you. My first question is to Secretary Blinken. As we know, Ukraine and USA started talks about security guarantees. Can you give us a little more information how it's going and when we will hear the first maybe results? І моє друге запитання до міністра Кулеби. Скажіть, будь ласка, чого ми очікуємо від Генасамблеї ООН, що буде невдовзі, які наші цілі, і з чим ми маємо звідти вийти?
Event.
So we are focused with our Ukrainian partners and many other countries around the world on two things. One is in the near term, in the immediate term, ensuring that Ukraine has what it needs to be successful on the battlefield in pursuing the counteroffensive and dealing with the current Russian aggression. And an important part of my visit here today was to do what we've been doing all along, which is to listen very carefully to our Ukrainian partners, to understand what they need in this moment, and to look at ways to support that. But even as we're doing that, it's critically important that we and many other countries that have agreed to do the same help Ukraine build a force for the future, a military force for the future, that is capable of deterring future aggression and, if necessary, defending and defeating it. We now have 29 countries that have signed on to a declaration issued by the G7 at the end of the NATO summit that is focused on doing just that, helping Ukraine build this force future. And we're in the early stages of talking directly with Ukraine about what the different elements would be. Other countries are similarly engaged or beginning to engage in those conversations. And as I indicated, that will, I think, play out over the coming months. It's important because we want to make sure that Ukraine is in a position for the long term, not just today, to deter aggression and to defend against it. We need President Putin to understand that he cannot outlast Ukraine, he cannot outlast Ukraine's supporters that Ukraine is actually going to grow stronger and even more effective with a military force that is world-class, but also a strong and vibrant economy and a strong and vibrant democracy. So all of these things together are the recipe for, as I said earlier, a Ukraine that not only survives this Russian aggression, but thrives in the future. That's the best possible response to what Putin has done. So this work on helping Ukraine build long-term deterrence and defense, as I said, we're beginning to engage in those conversations in detail, but this will be something that we work on in the coming months.
Генасамблея буде традиційно
General
насиченою.
Assembly will be very
Пріоритет номер один – це залучення
the
нових
priority
країн
number one
до
to include
реалізації
new
формули миру
countries to implementation of
президента
peace
Зеленського
formula,
і
President Zelensky peace formula,
здійснення
and to
наступних кроків, власне, на шляху
execute
до
the next
проведення
steps
глобального саміту
for
формули
the
миру.
holding global summit,
Пріоритет номер
global
два
peace summit.
– це,
Number two,
безумовно, питання
it's the issue of
експорту українського збіжжя на світові
export of
ринки.
Ukrainian grain
Це
to
в
the
цьому процесі,
world
ви
market.
знаєте, Організація
You
Об'єднаних
know
Націй
that
має свою роль.
UN has its own role in it.
В результатах цього
And as a
процесу
result of
надзвичайно
these
зацікавлений весь світ, особливо
and
країни
all the
Африки,
whole
Азії,
world, and especially
тому що
African and
глобальна
Asian countries
продовольча
are
безпека, ціни
very
на хліб
looking
зараз
forward to
залежать,
resolve this issue because the
на жаль,
prices for bread
від
is,
російського
unfortunately,
шантажу.
because of the
Ми
Russian
маємо
blackmail is
звільнити
growing.
світ
And we need to
від
ensure the
можливості
world
Росії
and to protect the world
шантажувати
from the
світ голодом.
possibility of Russia
Третя тема
blackmailing the world.
буде,
The third subject,
безумовно, будуть двосторонні зустрічі в рамках
bilateral
цього,
meetings during
цієї сесії Генасамблеї.
this
Там
United
будемо
Nations
говорити про
session.
зброю, про
We're going to
нові,
discuss weapons,
про нові оборонні
new
пакети і
defense
підтримку
packages
України.
to Ukraine.
Що ще? Ну, ще
what
буде,
else?
я переконаний, сотня якихось питань,
And
як
there will
завжди
be
це буває на
hundreds of other
Генасамблеї. Але з таких
questions that
великих,
we're going to discuss.
великих
But these
тем,
are the
то
major,
це ці три,
these
які я
are three
озвучив.
major issues and questions we're going to discuss.
Я вас вітаю. Як людина, яка це вперше робила, ви блискуче впоралися. Я би перед тим